Thank you all who are here. I get the honor of introducing Leopoldo. So I met Leopoldo López recently, but I've heard about Leopoldo López for decades. I think I first came across you when you were running for mayor, or maybe you were already mayor. And in your first race, you'd won 51% of the vote. In the second race, you won 81% of the vote, which is a big deal. And at the time, I was running a political organization that trained politicians in America. And I had so much respect for people who not just led movements, but put themselves on the line politically. And so I started following you back then and saying anyone who can get 30 extra points really matters. But then you started to lead movements for democracy and engage in real protest against the Chavez authoritarianism that was taking over Venezuela. And then you got imprisoned. And you got imprisoned in a horrible, trumped-up kangaroo trial where you weren't allowed to really bring anyone there to defend you, anybody to even be there as support other than your family, and imprisoned for 7 years in various different circumstances. And then after you escaped and made your way out, you were in exile and are now in exile running the World Liberty Congress, where you're bringing together the best democracy activists from around the world. I remember when I saw you at the Halifax Security Forum, it reminded me of the X-Men, the Avengers. It was like, there they are, right there, the heroes of our time. And Wolverine was my favorite. I'm not sure who played Wolverine in your world, but it's really an honor to be here with you and to be having this conversation. We've been told we're supposed to have a conversation, but my goal is really to bring all of you into it. So we'll have a conversation, but be thinking about the questions you have for all of us, because we'll break at about halftime and open it up to questions. But I want to start with the most basic question for you, which is, why do you care so much about democracy? It's a pretty abstract thing.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Rachel. Thank you for the introduction. Thank you to Skoll for the invitation. So, as you said, I'm from Venezuela, and Chavez won in the year 1999, and everything started to change. I was teaching at the time. I was working with an NGO, and I decided to run for office, and I lost for the Constituent Assembly, but I was unemployed. And then I decided to run again, and I ran for mayor of Caracas, of a part of Caracas, and I won. And I built a team of people that started to transform the city in many different ways. But in parallel to that, we started to see how democracy was fading. And it was very clear from the very early moments of Chavez that democracy was being attacked at its pillars. And it became very clear, not just for me, but for Venezuelans, that the big threat that was taking place and that was evolving was the dismantling of democracy. So the case of Venezuela is one where democracy was dismantled. Now we are a full-on autocracy compared to the worst autocracies in the world, with over 2,000 political prisoners, complete censorship, and on and on. The country has been destroyed. But when it started with an election. It started with democratic promises. It started with democratic ways of making decisions.
And Chavez was very popular.
Well, he was, but the thing is, he never had more than 54% of the vote.
Sure, but he had a majority.
He did. Then something happened in our country that could have been a blessing, but it became a curse. The prices of oil, Venezuela is an oil country, and the prices went from $15 per barrel to over $100 per barrel. So that created, a huge influx of fiscal income, but it distorted completely what was happening in the country. So there was this idea that this promise for socialism and what Chavez was promising was bringing prosperity to the people, which was not true. It was completely exogenous to the country, but that created kind of a buffer of 10 years of people not really recognizing what was happening. But when prices of oil collapsed, everything collapsed in Venezuela.
So it took me a long time to come to democracy, to be honest. I was a human rights activist. I cared a lot about Myanmar. That was Burma back then. I was involved with human rights, and then I worked in India and saw how the lack of a rule of law was harming people and hurting human dignity and hurting human flourishing and hurting real people because of their poverty. And it was only after kind of understanding that, oh, right, when you get to get rid of your leaders, when you get to hold them accountable from the lowest level of mayor all the way up, that allows you to change some of these things. And so I came much later in life to democracy as a cause that I really cared about. And I recognize now how foundational it is and also how flawed it is. And I want you to talk a little bit about this process of electing people who become autocrats, because that is the main way that we're seeing democracies collapse around the world, and you've seen it firsthand. So what is that process looking like, and what are some of the signposts that we should be aware of?
Well, we saw it in Venezuela 25 years ago, as I said, when Chavez was elected, and he was elected on the promise of dismantling everything that was built on the country. Venezuela was an island of democracy for the big part of the second 20th century. It actually was the country that supported countries under strong dictatorships in the southern part of Latin America, Chile, Argentina, Brazil, and also supported the process in Central America. But then, as I said before, started to lose democracy. And he came with promises to change everything through a constitutional, through building a new constitution. So everything was under this idea, fake idea, manipulated idea that healthcare, education, housing, roads, safety, public health, everything was going to be solved by changing the constitution. But what in fact happened was that the constitution changed in order to make the system more presidential, in order to have less checks and balances, in order to put the people that were loyal and close to Chavez in the positions that were supposed to check and balance the system. But because there was so much money coming in from the oil income, there was a mirage. So for many years, not until 2014, when we called for protests, there was this idea that Venezuela was an experiment of a tropical democracy or a Caribbean democracy. I think when you start to put adjectives to democracy, something is wrong. So when you start, oh, you know, we need to take care of Venezuela, it's something interesting is happening. And what was happening was this dismantling of the entire system. So it was gradual until it was full. So the process of going after journalists, for example, started very early on. And it started by convincing or forcing the owners of radio, TV stations to take uncomfortable journalists out of the screen or out of the microphone. Then of cutting the supply for paper for newspapers. And that evolved to a point where they closed TV stations and hundreds of radio stations. Same thing happened with the judiciary. It started by not opening the competition for judges to be qualified by their merits to become judges, which is what the Constitution said. So they declared emergency in the judicial sector just to designate directly all of the judges. And today in Venezuela, there is not a single judge, not a single one that is independent. There is not a single attorney of the General Attorney's Office that is independent.
So I'm going to go off script, and I hope it's okay. But you know what you're saying is so resonant in the United States right now, because we're, I think, at very early stages of some of this, and we're seeing it with the media, for instance, and so on. And one of the things that is really striking to me in the United States is that the polarization of the country enables a lot of this centralization of power, because that's what you're talking about with the constitutional system, the constitutional change in Venezuela, is that Chavez centralized power. We're also seeing the real personalization of power, the dismantling of bureaucracies so that power is held more centrally. And Chavez obviously did that too with his direct radio addresses and TV, direct to the people over and over. But the polarization in the country enables a lot of this to happen with some people's blessing, just over 50%, or maybe just under in some cases, but because they say, oh, you're centralizing power to get these other good things that I believe in or I want. In our case, a lot of people want our universities to change. A lot of people want some of the policies that are being offered. And in Chavez's case, a lot of people wanted to be lifted out of poverty, and they wanted. So when you, as an early leader of the opposition movement, these early protests, were trying to address this, and in Venezuela, I know a lot of the accusations against the pro-democracy leaders was elitism, that it was sort of poor versus rich. And so how did you address that? Do you think that the opposition addressed it well? And how did you get better over time? Sorry, I'm showing my biases here, but...
Yeah, well, it was polarized since the beginning, but it was a polarization where you had half of the country with a clear leadership and almost a blind following of that leadership, and it had the power of the state, which is not a small thing. And the other half of the country was fragmented. It was difficult to organize, but we actually did. We actually have been in a 25-year period of having different cycles of the opposition being organized in different ways. So we've gone to elections and lost. We've gone to elections and won. We've gone to negotiations and gotten nothing out of it. We've done street protests, not once, but hundreds of times, with a call for international pressure. So we've done everything. And this has been cycles. And the real challenge for us has always been how to organize and give legitimacy to the leadership. So we actually have gone to primaries in different moments of these 25 years. Primaries to elect the presidential candidate, the regional candidates, the municipal candidates. So that gives a very heavy weight of legitimacy to whoever is leading at different levels. And this was important. And if you compare Venezuela to other autocratic countries, the level of resilience and resistance and capacity to reinvent just how to do things of the Venezuelan opposition has been incredible. It's a tough game because until we win, we will always be losing. Mm-hmm. And the perception of people inside and outside will always be you've not done it right, because the ultimate goal is to transition to democracy. So people and public opinion are very hard. So we have cycles. We've seen that it's been very close. Last July, we won an election, 70% of the vote, but Maduro stole the election. Mm-hmm. And that has an impact on the way people feel. So one of the challenges is how to promote enthusiasm constantly, how to engage emotionally with the country to continue to go forward with this maybe abstract dream, but not when you don't have it, which is freedom. And this is something that I'm sure it's true for many other countries in the world. If you ask anyone from Venezuela, what does freedom mean to you? They will give you a personal anecdote. They will tell you, freedom to me is being with my family because I've not been able to be with my family for the past X number of years. Freedom to me is to post something in social media because I or someone I know was sent to prison because of what they posted on social media. Freedom means to have a fair trial because I know what it means to go to a Trump trial. Freedom to me is to freely assemble or to freely protest. So they will give you a very personal anecdote of what freedom means. If you do the same exercise in the US, and I do it constantly, or in Europe, and you ask young people or anyone, what does freedom mean to you? They will go to abstract,
it's not
just
personal
explanation of what it means. Maybe taking some philosopher or some political scientist or something much more abstract. So, at a personal level, I learned what freedom was when I was in prison. In solitary confinement, where I was not deciding what to eat, what to wear, when to see the light, when to go out. Somebody else was deciding that to me. So I learned the essence of freedom by being completely deprived from freedom. And I think that works for countries as a whole as well.
But when you're building the movement, I completely agree, by the way, and for countries that are earlier in that stage, when people don't have the personal experience yet, and yet you're trying to organize them, it seems to me there's a window of opportunity. I look at Poland, for instance, and how they managed to turn back their democratic erosion versus Hungary, which went so far that it's much harder now, or Turkey, much harder now. And I think, okay, you've got a window when elections can be won, and if you'd won 70%, in 2016, I don't know exactly when the election cycle was, then maybe they wouldn't have consolidated power enough and you could have actually taken over. Is there any way to speed the process up, do you think, before people have that personal anecdote of freedom and they don't know what it means to be dispossessed, but they're a little worried about what's going on, but they're still polarized? How do you get them to join a movement of some sort, or what lessons might you have learned, both from your own life, and then we're going to get into the World Liberty Congress, but other things you've thought about?
Well, I think that if there is a clear understanding of what the threat is, then there is a way to engage. And let me just compare this to, you're asking me about movement building. So let me compare it to another movement that many people here might be familiar with, the climate change movement. If we think of the climate change movement in the 1970s, 80s, early 90s, it was at the fringes. It was something was talked about in maybe some research areas and some organizations. Some of them were very vocal, like Greenpeace, but it was not mainstream until it reached a tipping point and it became mainstream. And mainstream in a way that it was mainstream for the right, for the left. It was mainstream for policymakers, researchers, businesses, school teachers, students. Everybody was thinking of this. And I think that tipping point had a lot to do with understanding the threat. At least that's the way I lived it. I'm part of the generation that was a teenager when they were telling us that there was going to be a hole in the sky and the ozone layer was going to collapse, and it was something like from Star Wars type of doomsday scenario. And that threat led to action. So I think that understanding the threat of autocracy, and let me give you some numbers of where we are now. So today, 72% of the world is living under some sort of autocratic regime. This is according to Freedom House, according to VDEM, according to the Economist Intelligence Unit, any way you measure it. So that's 5.7 billion people in the world that are living under some sort of autocracy. Is that a bad number? It is. But it's worse if we compare it to where it was 15 years ago. So 15 years ago, that number was 40%. So in the past 15 years, it's been doubling the amount of people that are living under an autocratic regime. And we can say, if we continue this path, well, maybe in 15 or 25 years, which is one generation, maybe only 5% of the world would be living in a free and democratic society. So understanding the threat, I think, is very important. Second, I think that one of the challenges, the main challenges that democracies have is not to fight against autocracy, but is to deliver to the people. Because as long as democracies don't deliver to the people, don't deliver to the expectations of the people, there's always going to be questioning. And we are in a very rough moment now because of the way reality is being communicated. Because it's just so fragmented, so manipulated, algorithm focused. There is a lot of interest of just creating this sense of chaos and of this complete dispersion.
For dystopia, yeah.
Yep.
Yeah. I think this is all extraordinarily true. And I also wanted to underline something you had said before. You said that in Venezuela, democracy started to fail bit by bit and then very quickly. It reminds me of the Hemingway quote about how someone goes bankrupt slowly and then all at once. And those numbers that you just cited, I'm on the board of Freedom House, and I know that one of the reasons they got so bad was that India tipped. India tipped into the partly free category, and 1 billion people suddenly ended up on the wrong side of that ledger. And you can imagine something similar if the United States tipped, if other large countries, Indonesia tips, you get a lot of people all of a sudden. Or you can get a lot of countries because regionally those dynamics can speed up. You get an area like the Sahel where military coups and stuff push a lot of countries in a direction. One thing that we're seeing is that as countries start tipping, they start working together. The world's dictators, Anne Applebaum has written this beautiful book about Autocracy Inc. and how the world's dictators are working together, not necessarily ideologically, they're often on quite different sides ideologically, but they understand the shared interest in autocracy. And I'm wondering from your perspective as an activist and someone who's organizing activists, how are you seeing the dictatorships working together to speed up this tipping process in the wrong direction?
So I think that's the second element of the reality that we're facing today. One is just the way in which autocracy has been growing over the past 15 years. But two is that autocrats are working together. And this is not along ideological lines. And this is very important because I think in the US, in Europe, in many democratic countries, people try to see reality through their own lens of local politics. So you try to see, who's the Republican, who's the Democrat, who's the conservative, who's the liberal in that dynamic. And it's not always that way. In terms of the way autocrats are working together, you see the alignment of the theocrats from Iran. You couldn't be more to the right of that if you put it in that spectrum, with the nationalists from Russia, with the communists from China, with the kleptocrats from Venezuela. There's no ideology there. There is just power and a common enemy. And that common enemy is democracy. And it's very clear. So a couple of days before, a week actually, before the invasion of Russia to Ukraine, Xi Jinping and Putin met. And they published a joint statement. And one of the paragraphs of that statement was the signaling of colored revolutions as a common enemy, that they would join forces, efforts to dismantle what they call the color revolutions. What are the color revolutions? The color revolutions are the freedom movements. The color revolutions are the movements that took place in the 1990s after the wall fell. The color revolutions is the Velvet Revolution from the Republic of Czech. The color revolution is what happened in Ukraine 2004 with Orange. These are freedom movements. And autocrats have been trying to label color revolutions as proxies of interest of the US or other countries. But what's, I think, significant is that they understand that that is a threat. When I read that, I said, if that is true, if that's what they are saying, if that's the enemy that they are identifying, we need to double down on
colored revolutions. I feel exactly the same way.
We need to assume, we need to own the history of the color revolutions, because movements need rooted history. You always look to, who inspires us, who are the leaders, who are the movements, what went right, what went wrong. That is very important for any movement. And I think that we need to own the color revolutions. And they do have incredible stories in each one of the countries. So that's what autocrats are doing. They're working together. And I have seen this in my own country play out in many different ways. So just to give you some examples. It plays out, all of them support diplomatically. So I've been to Geneva several times at the Human Rights Council. The Human Rights Council has the possibility of countries to present their own cases, and then the country responds, and then other countries make a comment, and then they vote. It's a huge room filled with people, and I've been there when they present the case of Venezuela several times. And it's always the same pattern. They present a terrible assessment of human rights in the country. Then Venezuela refutes that those are false claims. And then you have the participation. And then you have, North Korea, Eritrea, Uganda, Zimbabwe, Russia, China, Iran, Iraq, Afghanistan, Cuba, Nicaragua, all going one by one, making the same statements, almost copy-paste. And voting, of course, to support the regime. If you go to a session of Iran, it's the same. If you go to a session of Nicaragua, it's the same. So that's one way that you can really see graphically the way they collaborate. But that's not the only way. In the case of Venezuela, China has been instrumental, like it has been in Africa, to do financial lock-ins with these governments. So given that the IMF and the World Bank are so difficult to work with and to get credits is so difficult, then come the Chinese. And what do? They take governments and they say, you need $5 billion to build a port? Hey, I got it. You don't need to do any, no due diligence. If you want to pocket 2.5 billion of that 5 billion, that's fine. But if you don't commit, then the infrastructure will be managed by us. So they have been doing this. If you look at the Atlantic coast of Africa, there are 25 ports that are managed by China, 2 naval bases. So this is happening, and it's happening in Latin America as well. Then you have the military engagement. In the case of Venezuela, Venezuela was a NATO-engaged military system with the way, the training, the arms, and that shifted completely in the year 2007 to become a completely Russian system of buying the arms and doing the training. So now we have Sukhoi airplanes instead of F-16s. We have all of the air defense coming from Russia. We have the assault rifle, the AK-103. The training takes place in Russia. The Wagner group was in Venezuela for years, and we had been talking about this even before the invasion to Ukraine. If you look at Iran, Iran engages in different ways. Hezbollah has presence in Venezuela, and it's been reported and widely presented, but also they were instrumental for the regime when sanctions were imposed. Then came the the Iranian government and they said, we can show you how to evade sanctions. This is how you do it. This is how you do ship-to-ship transfers of oil in the open sea. This is how you take your oil from all the way from the Caribbean around the world to go to Chinese refineries. So this level of engagement, of real coordination, of real capacity building is happening on the autocrat camp. When we look at what's happening, again, the case of Venezuela, but this is true for many countries, we get a lot of statements saying we are deeply concerned about whatever issue. We're deeply concerned that you have military, political prisoners, or that you're closing down TV stations. But there is not the real action and engagement in the way we see in the autocrat camp.
Sure, it's nothing like these kind of trainings that Iran is running for your oil runners. I want to get back to a whole bunch of things that you've brought up, but one thing I really want to underline is your idea of the democratic side. You know, if the autocrats are learning, if the autocrats are working together, if they're engaging in these kinds of trainings, which we used to do for Democrats, you know, bring the Serbs from one color revolution to another group that wants to do a color revolution so they understand how to do it. We're not really fit for purpose for the 21st century. A lot of those tools that we created in the democracy movements are really 20th century ways of looking, and we're not moving fast enough and being active enough. You've started building the World Liberty Congress as a way of bringing together a democratic movement. And I think that's really important to underline because there have been, in the past, democratic movements. It's been country by country. The color revolutions, there's a reason that we don't claim them as a collective history, because that was Ukraine, that was Georgia, that was, you know, each country claims difference, and they are different, but they're not owning and helping one another in the same way. You're trying to create with the World Liberty Congress some consciousness of a global democracy movement. And one of the things I love about this is that a movement people can join. You can't become a Ukrainian, you can't become a Georgian. I mean, you can, but not many people are going to move to the country and seek their citizenship. But you can join a movement. And when I got involved in human rights as a kid, that was the era of Amnesty International concerts and BICO and U2. And you joined a movement that was joyful and exciting and something that you wanted to give yourself to. And that's what you're creating now. And so I want you to talk a little bit about the World Liberty Congress, your vision for it, and how you're trying to create both this sense of history that we all inherit, the Russian dissidents, the color revolutions, the people who have fought for freedom over the ages, and then what you're doing to focus them forward and move toward a better future.
So after 7 years of imprisonment, I escaped Venezuela and I came into exile. And exile is another form of imprisonment, and anybody who's been in exile knows this. And the most difficult thing is, so what do I do now? I mean, I love my country. My purpose is to fight for the freedom of my country. I have a tattoo of Venezuela in my leg. So how do I focus now? And I started to meet other people from many different countries. Today, two courageous women from the World Liberty Congress are here with us, Karine Kanimba from Rwanda and Janice Vakadaka from Bolivia. So I started to meet other people, and we started to talk about what was happening in our countries, how we were seeing the evolution of autocratic collaboration, as I explained before, and we decided to create a movement. So we decided to invite other people. Alongside with Masih Alinejad from Iran and Garry Kasparov, we started to reach out to other people around the world. That we are very different in any way you can look at it. Skin color, religion, history of our countries, language.
Ideology, right?
Even ideology. But when we spoke about what it means to fight against autocratic regimes, it was us talking to people from our own movement. And this is at a global level. This is people from Latin America talking to people from the Middle East, from Southeast Asia, and understanding that what you go through as a democracy defender and as a freedom fighter in Iran or in Venezuela or in Hong Kong is very similar. So we decided to give it a shot, to do an alliance, and we met for the first time in Lithuania in November of 2022. We had representatives from 40 countries, and it was an incredible gathering, led by activists, for activists, of people having the same purpose, the same idea. We met then in 2023, And what we did, I think, was crucial to separate what we are doing from a conference. We're not a conference, we're not an NGO, we are a movement. And being a movement, we elected the Leadership Council. So we had 300 plus people in Lithuania, and everybody had the possibility to vote for their representatives to the Leadership Council. And it was an incredible experience to see people just even crying, because these are democracy defenders that never had the opportunity to vote for something meaningful before in their lives. People from Syria, people from China, people from different countries that were very taken by the fact that they were putting their vote in a ballot box. And of course, this was a small group of people, 300 people, but the meaning, because that's what we fight for. The possibility of everyone having the chance to have a say through their vote. It's a simple but powerful idea. And that's the idea that has been taken away from us. So we elected the Leadership Council, then we elected an Executive Council. And this year, we are going to have our third General Assembly in Berlin. So we went to Berlin, spoke with the mayor of Berlin and others, and we are organizing what's called the Berlin Freedom Week. So it will be from November 8th to November 14th, in the context of the 35th anniversary of the fall of the wall. We are going to have an entire week with different activities. We're going to have the Congress of the World Liberty Congress that will take place at the Berlin City Parliament. So it will be, just to give a visual idea, the alternative to the UN. Just very legitimate. People will be voted to be delegates. People will be representing their countries. Their regions or countries or issues will be discussed. So that will take place 2 days. And then we will have, throughout the week, different gatherings. One on technology and freedom. Another one on backsliding democracies that you were talking about. Another one about gender apartheid. Another about climate change and autocracy. So all of these specific issues are part of the same big problem, autocracy. Autocracy is the big disease we need to first recognize and then deal with it. If you think about climate change, the root cause of climate change is autocracy. So China is putting into the atmosphere more than 30% of CO2. And if you look at migration flows are massive when you have an autocratic regime, either Russia invading Ukraine, or Syria going into civil war, or Venezuela going the south in terms of democracy. People flee the autocratic nations. So that's the main reason of the largest migration flows in the country. If you look at human rights violations, where do they take place? In autocratic countries. If you look at poverty, if you care about poverty, if you care about inequality, well, poverty and inequality are most present in autocratic countries. So this is what we are in the process. That's our hope, to create a huge movement. This is something that nobody owns, because this is something that not a person, not an organization, not a country can tackle by themselves. But much in the same way that climate change became a movement that it reached all different areas. We want a movement for freedom, democracy, and as you said, it needs to be attractive, sexy, cool. It needs to have music, art, culture. It needs to bring young people. Because if we are defending democracy by lamenting and by being, a group of people who are just talking, the negative
what used to happen,
No, it usually happens, but that's not the best way to engage with young people. That's not the best way to, talk about, what is it that we're fighting for. You fight for a promised land. You fight for a world that is changing. You don't fight to retain the status quo. And I think that's something that's needed. And it happened in the past. I think, it happened during the 1990s. It was a moment, where everybody was engaged in this new possibility of the entire world becoming democratic and, open markets. Well, now we know where we are, 30 years after that. But we need to build another cycle of enthusiasm for democracy and freedom.
I think that's exactly right. It's why I'm so excited. Can we invite everyone to come November 8th to 14th?
Yeah, no, you're all invited. So it's going to take place, as I said, in Berlin. You can go to our website, worldlibertycongress.org. we will be publishing information. Everyone is invited. We will be posting the program, and you will meet just incredible people, and people with the same commitment to this idea. We will have concerts, we will have documentaries and films of people from our network. We are bringing the freedom musicians, people who played in Tahrir Square in Egypt, people who played in the protests in Cuba with Patria y Vida, people who played in the women protest in Iran. People who are not only good musicians, but are activists for this idea. And it's just, and again, this needs a lot of heart. And it needs a lot of commitment.
And we need to connect the dots for people because, I want all of Skoll to understand that the connections between, women's education and so on. I know the research, right? It's not a perfect correlation. We do see countries that are autocrats that do some of these good things. Yeah. But on the whole, the non-outliers, absolutely autocracy is behind every single one of the things that everyone in Skoll is fighting against. But we don't have that message out. And so figuring out how do you get that message out? How do you get it widespread? How do you not let these regimes whitewash themselves with this little good thing here, that little good thing there? Really important. And how do you bring the hope?
Yeah.
Now, one of my heroes was Gene Sharp. And Gene Sharp wrote many, many books that were too big, and then one book that was fairly small about how to bring down the pillars of authoritarianism. And he talked about pillars of regime support and how you brought them down. I also want to think about how you build up. And so I want you to address a little bit 3 different areas: philanthropy, business, and the security sector. Let me just underline, and then I'll let you go. But first of all, we know that outsiders matter to democracy movements. Lots of research showing that outsiders are not decisive, but they matter. Philanthropy is one of the key ways in which outsiders can help. But how can they help now? How can they play a role now? Business usually is on the wrong side of a lot of these. I can go back to Hitler's Germany or to Ortega, but business is usually willing to go along with autocrats for quite a while because they're promised this or that thing that helps them. But eventually, they sometimes turn. So how do we get the business sector to be more on the side of democracy? And then the security sector, a lot of people find that kind of icky and they run away. That's always been my area of work, has been military and police, in part because where a democracy falls is almost entirely determined by whether the guns are turned at the people or at the regime. Mm-hmm. And you know this firsthand because my understanding is that it was some security sector defectors who finally let you out mm-hmm. of arrest and let you abscond. So I want you to address these 3 sectors: philanthropy, business, security sector. How do we get them on side for this movement for democracy?
Yeah, so a brief comment on Gene Sharp. So Gene Sharp, as you said, he wrote a lot about how to transition from dictatorship to democracy. And he wrote a handbook with dozens of things that people could do through nonviolent action. We read the handbook 150 times, and we did all of the things that Gene Sharp recommended and more. And Maduro still there. So while Gene Sharp made a great contribution in the 1990s.
It was decades ago. It needs to be.
Yeah, this is decades. This is 1980s, 1990s. It has not been updated. That thinking, that strategic thinking, has not been updated. And things have changed. As I said before, the world is more autocratic now. So one of the things that we're doing that I would like to share is that we are building an ecosystem of researchers and activists to think about this issue and to create a playbook against autocracies that can take all of the input from people who are doing specific research on movement building, civil resistance, sanctions, political prisoners, unlawful detentions, fake news. Just all of these are vectors that are affecting the same issue. Mm-hmm. And we are bringing together researchers from Harvard, Stanford, Cornell, Syracuse, UVA, Columbia, and other universities from Europe, Latin America, Africa, in order to bring researchers with people in the ground and rethink about this. So a comment on that. On philanthropy, I think philanthropy, it's called to play a huge role for different reasons. The main one is first to recognize the threat, so I'll talk about that, but 2, the flexibility that philanthropy has, many governments don't have. Not necessarily the mission of a philanthropic organization is the strategic security mission of a country. So they will support for different reasons. So I think philanthropy can be very pure, or can be at least very clear in terms of committing to a mission. If that mission is human rights, democracy, freedom. But there is a lot to be done. If you look at US philanthropy, that is around $500 billion, as it was said yesterday, less than 2% goes to democracy promotion. And of that 2%, only a fraction of that goes to promoting democracy outside the US. So there is very little that is taking place. And I think it needs to be very compelling for US, European philanthropic organizations to understand that this issue really matters and that they could be a real impact. As I said before, if you care about women's rights, if you care about gender equality, about climate change, about migration, about poverty, you need to care about autocracy, because that's the root cause that you need to care of. So I think that there is, and I hope that there is new conversations happening. Somebody said it yesterday, I think Olivia mentioned it yesterday, that there needs to be more of a risk-taking attitude towards philanthropy. Sometimes it's very safe just to invest in just safe issues, education, running water, vaccines. I'm not saying that those are not issues to be supported. What I am saying is that supporting the democracy space requires more commitment, because it can put you at the center, as it's been true for some organizations, of some controversies. But there are ways.
And the World Bank and IMF support mostly autocracies, actually. When they're doing their work in these areas, it's actually on the wrong side of a lot of this, because that's where the problem is.
And I think that places like Skoll and other gatherings where you have different people to rethink how to focus their philanthropy, I would just hope that the conversation starts, that the conversation is present, that when you're talking about climate change, or when you're talking about whatever of the issues that are taking your attention, please think of autocracy. Think of what this really means. Think of what it means for 5.7 billion in the world not living with the same rights that you are living. People who cannot speak their mind, cannot move freely, cannot leave their countries, cannot work in the areas that they would like to work.
But also can't protest against poverty, can't protest against girls' education, can't push their own governments in these ways for the things we take for granted.
So that's philanthropy. Then you asked about business. One of the things that we are doing, and we hope to present in Berlin, is we are building an index of publicly traded companies and their exposure to autocratic regimes. So let me explain myself. The idea is to analyze the ways in which different companies, publicly traded, have some influence of autocratic government. So we are analyzing where are their headquarters. We are analyzing their supply chain. We're analyzing their revenue stream. And that gives you an idea, and we're putting together an index, an idea of the level of exposure that different companies have. And if these are publicly traded companies, this can become an index for investors to make a conscious decision, much in the same way that people decide to invest in carbon-free investments or slave-free investments. So the idea is to expose that this is another level of engagement that companies have, and that if it becomes public, it becomes clear, then companies will make a decision. Less than 10 years ago, there were companies that were selling massive outlets of clothing that was being manufactured in Uyghur China with slave labor. Once that was exposed, they had to take their factories away from China. It happened in South Africa. And there are many examples. So doing this with publicly traded companies is something that we're doing for business. And then the military and defense. I think it's strategic that that those who are engaged in thinking stability from the defense and security perspective understand that democracy, it's always going to be more stable. And strengthening democracy, it's also strengthening security and defense. And I think that this is starting to happen. We were together at the Halifax Security Conference that takes place at the end of a year. And at least a conversation about democracy was present. And I hope that this continues to be. Because It is. I mean, if you think of Venezuela, how it's become the hub for terrorism, for narcs, for all sorts of money laundering, that of course has an impact in the security for the entire region.
Absolutely, and I think one of my worries right now is that Europe is rearming, and they're cutting a lot of foreign aid, same as the United States has cut a lot of foreign aid, but at least they have a reason for it. But if they're going to rearm because they're worried about Russia, they should be thinking about the money they can give to democracy movements, because otherwise they're sort of using the military to fight instability, but it's going to continue to build.
So the best, this is an important idea. If you look at the wars that the U.S. has been engaged for the past 60 years. They've won every war militarily. The U.S. won Vietnam. The U.S. won Iraq. The U.S. won Afghanistan. The U.S. won Libya. Militarily, but they lost a war. Why? Because they were not able to have the hearts and the minds of the people from those countries. There's been a lot written about this, but what we are saying, and this is a central idea to our efforts, we are not calling for a colonialist and imperialist approach to the destiny of our country. What we are saying is that the people from Rwanda, from Bolivia, from Venezuela, from Iraq, from all of these countries, we want to be free. And we want to take the ownership of the risks and of the path forward, but we need the support because the regimes that are in place now have the support of this autocratic network in the world. But I think we need to change this concept because it's very, very often that these autocrats, they say, oh, these are movements that are being financed by the CIA or by the US or by obscure interests. This is an imperialist. We don't want an empire. We don't want colonialism. We want democracy. And that means that we want people to have the possibility to vote, to decide their destiny through their vote. We want rule of law, and we want individuals to be respected in their basic individual human rights.
That's the basics. So I promised I would open it up, and I'm about to open it up, so come up with your questions. I'm going to ask one more very short question. I was told to end with what gives you hope, and I hate that question. People ask me that all the time, and there are times when actually I don't feel a lot of hope, and I hate having to put it out there. It takes a lot of energy when you're actually feeling like, it's pretty rough right now. I have a lot of drive, and the drive comes from a sense of history that there have been times that have been good in human history, and there have been times that have been less good. But the arc isn't like this. The arc is like this, and it goes up. And it goes up because humans are pushing it up. And each time it goes up a little further and a little higher. And there's a real clear directionality, even if you're in a divot. And your job in the divot is to push that ball further up. And so that gives me a lot of drive. But it's also because I feel like doing this work, and I'm sure this is true for all Skoll people, it's not really about having a sort of dream and being all airy-fairy about it. I think of it like a muscle. You build a muscle, and you build a muscle to have integrity and to do things for the right reasons over the right time. And over time, it just becomes easier and easier to exercise the muscle and less thinkable to not exercise the muscle. And we have, ideals about what we do. So I think about Anne Frank as a Jewish woman. I think, we know that story. Do I want to be Anne Frank or do I want to be the jailer? Well, her story doesn't end well, but it's really clear to me that I want to be Anne Frank, not the person who tells on her. And I want to be Luke Skywalker, not the stormtrooper. Mm-hmm. So the muscle memory and this sense of drive and this sense of, I know what this story is and what role I'm going to play, those are what give me activism. And so I want to ask you the same question. What gives you the drive to continue in this moment?
Well, I think hope is not rational, and many very committed, smart people try to rationalize hope. And I think by definition, if you try to, put a straight line from where you are to where you want to be and think, that's hope, that's rational. It's not, you need to be engaged with a purpose. What is it that moves you? And for me, it's just understanding that it's this idea of having a free country. And now I understand, after being in exile, not because I wanted to, because circumstances led me to be in exile. Now, for me, the fight for freedom in Venezuela doesn't have any borders, because now the same fight for the freedom of Uganda, the freedom of Rwanda, the freedom of Nicaragua, it's the same. I feel the same, and that makes me grow as a person. It makes me feel good. You have a good cause, something that you truly believe in, and for me, and I always tell the people from our movement, we need to understand that this is an infinite fight. That it's just, you need to decide what you want to do in life. Life is long, is short, whatever way you want to look at it, but you need to decide what is it that you want to do. And this is a blessing. If you decide, I want to dedicate for something the rest of my life that I know it's going to have an impact, and there will be highs, there will be lows, but that gives you at least a sense of why to wake up every day. And if you get other people engaged in this, it's always going to be there. Even if we win democracy in Venezuela, I know that we will be fighting for the democratic system not to be toppled by. So it's an infinite fight. And it's like, all right, so this is it. And I have learned to appreciate, in terms of leadership characteristics, the desert. So for me today, when I think of references of leadership, maybe I think of the same people, but not of the same moments of their lives. Today, I really try to understand and admire the desert. The desert of, why is it a biblical metaphor? It's there in the Old Testament, it's there in the New Testament. In the Old Testament, God tells Moses, you will take your people to the promised land, but Moses, you will not cross the river. You will not see it, you will not cross, but you will take the people there. So it's just, this is always there. You get filled with doubts, self-doubt. You look at sometimes in the mirror, you're like, what am I doing? But, that moment in the desert, I think is what I think can make you stronger. Because as you say, this is a cycle. And the moments of the dip, the moments of difficulty are the moments where you need to be a CEO, which is a chief emotional officer. You need to just be very committed to just rallying behind an idea and having fun. But this is a tough space. It's tough. Every day I get a call, I get a message from somebody in Venezuela or part of our network that has been abducted. We have two founding members of the World Liberty Congress. One of them from where's Telene from? From Swaziland. 2 months after we inaugurated the World Liberty Congress, he went back to his house in front of his wife and his 2 kids, Tanele. Thugs came into his house, hired by the king, and he was shot in the head. Our other friend, Fonike from Guinea, another founding member, he was abducted. We don't know anything of him for the past 9 months. So these are the realities. We have my very close friends that started the movement. They're in prison now.
You might be scaring people from joining the movement.
But I think, I'm sorry. Not my intention. But I think it's important just to be very clear what it means to be at the front lines. What it means to be at the front lines. And the front lines, by the way, is not a geographical definition. My friend, sister, co-founder of the World Liberty Congress, Masih Alinejad, she was the target of an assassination attempt at her house in Brooklyn, New York, and she just went to trial last week, and the people that were caught were found guilty. They were hired by the Iranian regime, and the Iranian regime hired members of the Russian mob to kill Masih.
Yet another way they're working together.
Yeah, that's another. So this is the truth. This is the reality, and we need to, as you said at the beginning, the Avengers. The simple narratives sometimes are very important. I think that when you elevate and try to put too much sophistication into explaining things, you get disengagement. You need, simple narratives just to get engaged, to mobilize. That's why music is important. That's why art is important. That's why state of consciousness is important. That's why you need to talk about people. How do they feel? How do you feel internally? How can this fight make you a better person? That's the only way to keep going forward every day.
So I promised I'd open it up, but I can't see anybody, so I'm not quite sure how we're going to do this. Okay, we've got some mics back here, and there's a person right here. Oh, they turned up the lights. Now I can see you.
Good morning. Does this work? It does. Okay. Good morning, and thank you for everything. I have a question reflecting on what you said before about the international community. I would like to deep down a little bit in the different windows of opportunities that Venezuela had, the different windows that opened and closed, and how the international community reacted to the approaches. Because I ask that because I feel that at the same time your country and others fight for democracy, I think there is a silent fight for democracy within the international institutions that are not the most democratic. And I would like to know how you feel those fights for democracy are synchronized or not, if they can happen at the same time. There is a claim for more democratic international institutions. You mentioned an alternative to the UN, the financial institutions of the world, the Pact for the Future. They're claiming for a different distribution of power. And I think if that's an advantage or is an obstacle for a fight for democracy at the national level.
Well, that's what we are trying to do with the World Liberty Congress, precisely to create a community with a common understanding. We are focused in countries that are autocratic, because it's very common that when you start talking about democracy, the conversation either goes all over the place or it ends up in a specific country. So I live in Spain. So if I talk about democracy and autocracy, some people might say, oh, so what do you think about Sanchez? And you end up talking about a dynamic that is democratic with its own institution, its own polarized reality, but it's within its reality. Same thing, if it happens in the US. So at least I have a simple rule of thumb when talking about democracy, is that you have at least three conversations. One, the one taking place in functioning democracies, US, Europe, Japan, South Korea, Australia, which is a conversation about how to make democracy better. And the US and other countries are under extreme polarized circumstances, but it's about how can we make democracy better. Then you have places, you can say Hungary or Venezuela 15 years ago and many other countries that are democratic but are backsliding, and it's very clear that they're going to become, if not already, an autocratic regime. And then the conversation there is, well, how do we save democracy? How do we save it? And then the rest of the world, and that's where we are focused at the Liberty Congress, are places where you don't have democracy. And the conversation and the path and the challenge is how to conquer democracy. So it's very different. And if you try to mix everything, you end up giving advice to people who are fighting against dictators to do, good lobbying to local elected members. So I mean, why would you do a lobbying to an elected member of the regime of Maduro that has absolutely no impact? But so tactics are different, approaches of what needs to be done are different, and I think it just helps. And I think in terms of the countries that are losing democracy, I have been seeing a lot of engagement with people who are worried about this and trying to see, at least understand the red flags and what are the common patterns of what it means to be backsliding from democracy to autocracy.
And I'll just add to that I think there's a lot of back and forth in terms of lessons learned between the people who are in full autocracies and who saw that path, for some of them where it eroded and wasn't a coup or what have you, and the ones in the middle sector that are eroding democracies. How do you avoid what's already happened? What are the lessons there? But they are separate conversations to have.
Yep.
More questions. We can take a couple too. Okay, there's a question over here and a question over here. Why don't we take these two together?
Hi. Oi, bom dia. Buenos dias. So my name is Luana Genot. I'm from Brazil. I work with racial and climate literacy, and I'm also advisor for President Lula in terms of inclusion and climate. And as you're saying that, basically, autocrats, they collaborate. I wanted to hear from you if you have seen any collaborations that work among countries that are maybe at risk with democracy, as it is happening in Brazil. And, if something that is really helpful for us when you're facing this, and also dialogues we can have with some sort of religious, let's say, institutions, because Brazil is kind of facing this topic, when autocrats are, using religion to kind of domain the conversation about how they should behave in terms of the next steps for our democracy. So, yeah, just want to hear your thoughts.
Actually, that was two questions, so let's take just that, and then we'll go to you. So if we can just hand the mic here, but hold your question for a minute so we can answer these two.
Yeah, thank you very much for your presentation.
I'm sorry, can you just hold the question, because I don't want us to forget the question, and we'll come right back to you.
I think it's the challenge that you are presenting is a challenge of politics, and I think Brazil, it's a democracy. I mean, Brazil has elected their president. It's polarized like many other democracies, but it's not an autocracy. And I sometimes read, I think, misguided conflicts that are taking place. I have read some people trying to present what's happening in Argentina as a struggle between autocracy and democracy, and it's not. And in my view, it's a different type of polarization, it's a different type of dynamic, but it's not autocracy, democracy. I think same in Brazil. So it's a challenge, as you say, those who are manipulating with religion or engaging with different groups. Well, you need to re-engage. I mean, if you want to build an alternative, you need to go out and build that alternative with grassroots and with movement building. And with respect to conversations and working together, I think that we need more of that in Latin America, but more of that not alongside of ideological spectrum. I think Latin America it's very polarized in the way different organizations group meet, either from the right and from the left. And I think that this is a different way of gathering people around democracy and autocracy. And I am, at least, this is my deep conviction, is democracy. And I have absolutely no problem in coexisting with those who are center-right, center-left, center-center, but are democratic, that adhere to the core values of democracy, because that's what democracy is. It's alternative. It's alternance. It's, giving the possibility of having governments from one side and from the other according to what the people decide. And we need more of that in Latin America for sure.
And just to underline on the Brazil question, because I've had to answer this in the United States as well, I think we conflate these categories at our peril, because when you still have free elections that are really not very tilted, which is the case in the United States, it's the case in Brazil. They're tilted a little. The United States kind of mastered the gerrymandering and so on, and Brazil certainly has its own challenges. But you can win at the ballot box in a way that you could win in Poland in the ballot box, but it's harder in Hungary and it's less possible in Turkey. So you can see kind of a gradual decline. When you can still win at the ballot box, your job is to win at the ballot box. Your job is to push back for democracy by organizing people through the main way that you have to win. And if you're losing at the ballot box, one has to ask, why are you losing? What's the problem with your movement? And it's what we're asking in America right now, what I'm asking at least in America right now. If you're losing and someone you think is breaking the rules, the democratic rules, is winning, and maybe they're using religion to win, well, why are they winning versus you? Because it's a fair fight. And really thinking about how do we get around the polarization, how do we bring in religion, how do we bring in other forms of motivation, we the Democrats, small d Democrats in these countries. But it's a different question than when you can win 70% of the vote and still lose the election or not be allowed to take the election. So it's just different. I promised you the next question.
Yeah, thank you very much. Sarah Birete from Uganda. I thank the speaker for the presentation. Uganda presents a unique challenge. We have, just to mention a few examples, is we have the president of the Bar Association living in exile because of demanding for judicial accountability with 2 arrest warrants on his head by judges. We have an HRD advocate in jail by the military court, Aaron Kiza. we have government proposing to amend the NGO Act to make sure that all grants coming from outside Uganda are approved by cabinet, including private funding. And, we have a closing of funding in the country. EU Basket Fund closed, of course, USAID, which is global, and some of the other countries that are really withdrawing from funding governance work. And we have an opposition leader in jail, of course, Kizza Besigye, by the military court after being abducted from Kenya. And all this is coming, with a 40-year-old dictator in power seeking re-election in the next few months, whose son is the head of the army and exercises, excessive impunity. So I want to ask, what advice would you give for some of us who are HRD, HRDs in Uganda, still keeping at the front line, trying to push back and make sure that citizens have a voice in their governance? But also, what opportunities do you see, if any, in a context like ours? Thank you.
No, thank you. Well, in Uganda, I think you have an incredible window of opportunity. I mean, you have an election, and you have great leadership. You have Kizza in prison, but you have Bobi Wine, who is being threatened by the son of the dictator who's running the armed forces, but he's still in the streets and he's still mobilizing. He did an incredible performance in the last election. He claimed win the election, and I believe that the entire Ugandan society should rally behind who could become the candidate. Maybe they will disqualify Bobby. I don't know if they are scared of him, but I am sure that even if that happens, as it happened in Venezuela, you can have another candidate, unite against the candidate, and make sure that you win the election. Will the election be rigged? Yes, they might try to rig the election, so you can figure out ways to prove what happened in each one of the ballot boxes. That's what we did in Venezuela. 16,000 voting centers, 38,000 voting machines. And we had a person in every single voting machine. And within 48 hours, we were able to upload and to present the results of every single voting machine that took place. And it was undefeatable by the regime that we had won the election. So I think that's what needs to be done. And I think Uganda, being the youngest country in the world, can give a tremendous sign of hope, of mobilization, and that it will have a tremendous impact, not through the Great Lakes, but beyond. I think that Uganda invading now South Sudan or sending its troops to defend the dictator of South Sudan, of course, it's something that we need to condemn, but with a democratic government, a government that engages with the commitment of fighting for freedom, human rights, democracy, that I'm sure someone like Bobi Wine will for sure will commit and deliver on this idea. So if I was Ugandan, I would be very optimistic. And I would be completely engaged, and I will be in the streets, and I will be rallying for change, and I will be doing it much in the same way that it's being done with music. So Bobi Wine, the leader of the Ugandan opposition, he's a rapper. He used to be, still is, a musician. That's how he became known in the youngest country in the world. And now, he's leading with great commitment, but with music, with a different way of engaging for the people. So I would be happy and engaged because I know that the promised land of our victory will be close.
I'm also going to add, sorry to take off the high, but in Brazil, one of the ways that election was secured was by getting the diplomats to okay it right after, very, very quickly. And if you reach out to the diplomatic community of pro-democracy countries in Uganda, that will be very important as well, because to get the votes that you've won, and then have the diplomats say, yes, you actually won, that'll matter. And I think the invasion of South Sudan is a very big chip, because no country wants to deal with another big, horrible war. And to say, look at what this government is doing, you don't want this government. If we actually win, you want to okay that win and put some force behind it, is another way that you can help there.
And also, so just on that point, I think one of the challenges that you would have is to make the window of opportunity that Uganda has something that other African countries and beyond can connect to. It's not just an Uganda issue. No, this is going to have a tremendous impact in the entire region.
Absolutely. We've got a question up here.
Hi, Leopoldo, thanks. And thanks for all the work you're doing. I wanted to hear your thoughts on how we think about multilateral...
Can you introduce yourself?
I'm sorry, I'm Daniel Sachs. I work on the first two of your three categories, less on autocracy, but more about renewal of democracy and what are still the democratic parts of the world. So I wanted to hear your thoughts on how do we think about multilateralism in an increasingly authoritarian world? I mean, if the 28% are still kind of remaining democratic, but to Rachel's point before, the IMF and the World Bank, etc., are working where the problems are, which is largely in the other part of the world, but also a lot of the funds and these days commitments to things like climate. You know, when the US is very doubtful on climate commitment, but places like the Gulf, you know, at least are saying the right things and are putting money towards this. And so how do we maneuver that? I mean, there are two extremes. One is not collaborating with these regimes at all in the Gulf or China, etc. The other is open, you know, like we did in the days of early globalization, we open up the floodgates and we engage without any principles. Mm-hmm. So somehow we need to find a sort of principled engagement in these types of issues. But I think this is a big issue because we can't wait for the world to democratize before we tackle climate change. So how do you think about that?
Well, as you said, the thinking, you know, after the fall of the wall 35 years ago was that the opening up of a globalization was the spearhead for a trickle-down democracy, right? That was the thinking. You open with markets and then democracy will follow. You know, 35 years after, we know that it didn't work. I think that there needs to be an engagement around democracy that it's not happening. It's certainly not happening now. You do not have a unified approach by Europe, US, Canada, New Zealand, South Korea, Japan, in terms of promoting democracy. It's not happening. It's a very small space, and I think what we are trying to do is to build a global appeal to this. Why this is important. Just for the world, why this is an issue that shouldn't have any borders, why winning Uganda will be important for Africa and beyond, why winning Venezuela will be important for Venezuela and beyond, and try to understand that this is a way to engage in these other causes as well. As we said, autocracy is related to climate change, to human rights, and to many other issues. It's not easy, but it's possible because the people are there. That's what we are trying to do, is just to understand the problem in a way that we can share. And I think that's a big step. If we come to an understanding that, one, this is a problem that is growing. Two, autocrats are working together. Three, there is no network building on the democratic side, and we need to work on that. Three, then you can go into specifics. How do we use technology? For example, we use stable coins in order to provide support to medical doctors and nurses in Venezuela, and then to do all the electoral build-up to win the election, because we couldn't use the financial system in Venezuela. We use Bitcoin and stablecoin. So how do you bring technology to this conversation? How do you use new tools in order to communicate? So I think that the multilateral approach that you're talking about, I would put more faith in a civil society type of engagement than just waiting for governments to take the lead. I think that's important. But if we don't have this type of engagement of researchers, philanthropists, NGOs, different like cross-border organizations, it's going to be much more difficult that the governments engage. If we have that level of engagement, that's what we're trying to build, I think we will be able to convince and to move governments from the democratic side to work together. And then one final thought. There has been this idea that promoting regime change is toxic. So let me give you an anecdote. I was in prison 7 years. I go to Washington, D.C., and I started talking about this. And I said, we're a group of freedom fighters, and we're promoting regime change. And I would see the faces of the people saying, like, whoa, that's kind of heavy what you're saying. I was like, what do you mean? oh, regime change, that's a loaded word. And I was like, I've been maybe in a refrigerator for too long. Okay, so can you update me on why this is toxic? So they explain, Afghanistan, okay, I get it. So I can sugarcoat if you want. I can say it's not regime change, I can call it political change, I can call it democratic transition, but the core of what we are fighting for is to substitute autocratic governments that have no respect for human rights, no respect for rule of law, to democratic governments. And it's political at the core. That's what we are about.
Peacefully.
Yeah, peacefully.
So we are unfortunately out of time. I'm sorry. We have a little thing here blinking at me, telling me that I'm supposed to let you go to your next appointment. But please join me in thanking Leopoldo for all that you're doing.